Thank you for that introduction, Lindsay. Is the mic now picking me up? Okay, great. And thank you all for being here on a snowy Thursday to hear about how I try to glorify God through my work as a psychological scientist to understand how religiousness is associated with health. The psalmist wrote, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all God's benefits." And in the blurb that got sent out for today, I promised to share what we know about how religiousness is associated with benefits, and in particular with health benefits, and how my work has been part of that. In order to explain how my work and my scholarship is related to my faith, though, I need to tell a little bit of the story of how I came to do this work, and Lindsay shared a little bit of that as well. So this is me as a toddler with my mom and my dad in the late 80s. It might seem like I could not have been doing anything at this point that was relevant to my scholarship. However, I was growing up with these two people as my parents. They were both social workers who had met at Lutheran Social Services, but who also had done formal study of religion. So my mom was a religion major in college. My dad went to seminary. So they both found their way to the career of social work. But religiousness was a topic of conversation in our household, and from a social science sort of perspective. Like, why do people go to church? What is this doing for them? Why do people act in the ways that they do as religious people? And so those kinds of questions were like fair game and regular conversations on our 30-minute drive to and from church on Sunday mornings. When I got just a little bit older, I landed at Luther College, as Lindsay said, as a pre-med student. Like a third of our students come into Hope pre-health. And I sort of figured that out, as Lindsay said, that maybe that wasn't the path for me. But like at Hope, all students at Luther are required to take a set of religion courses. The requirement is, though, that you first take a religion course in the Bible. So you need to take Intro to Bible, Intro to Old Testament, Intro to New Testament. I took Intro to the Hebrew Bible with the Reverend Dr. Richard Simon Hansen, seen here. And Simon was long retired when I had him as a professor. He had, in fact, been my mother's advisor when she was, and he was near retirement at that time, right? So he was out of retirement to kind of help out the religion department, which really needed somebody to come in and help out. And he was a Hebrew scholar, a Hebrew Bible scholar. And in his class, I really learned to read the Bible with a particular focus on the humanity of the people in the stories. And our final assignment was to write an account of one of the stories in the Hebrew Bible from the perspective of one of the people in the story. And so I wrote about the story of Absalom, a story of forgiveness, right? So sort of prefiguring some of my research there. So I wrote about the death of King David's son, Absalom, but from the perspective of Maha, Absalom's mother. And that assignment really opened me up to approaching the Bible and to approaching religiousness itself with a curiosity about how people experienced it and an empathy for people who, in their religious beliefs and behaviors. I brought that curiosity to a course I was taking called Psychology of Health and Illness. That's my actual syllabus because everything's digital since I was in college. So I can, and it was taught by this guy who is Dr. Lauren Toussaint, a researcher, health psychologist, who studies associations of forgiveness and health. And I quickly was very lucky to start to do research with him. This is my first research paper or poster ever. Again, everything's digital in that part of my life, so I get to share it with you. And here I am. I'm presenting at the Midwestern Psychological Association meeting, where my current department brings lots of students every year. And in fact, at this meeting, I met one of my heroes, Charlotte Wayfleet, who then was my chair when I came here. And so in this lab, I got to do research on forgiveness. And I was also interested in religion. So Lauren does research on how forgiveness is related to health. And I saw that within the sort of context of other religious behaviors and practices and values, and how might those connect to health. In that early work, I learned a lot about forgiveness, have some publications from that time showing that forgiveness is related to better physical health, including mortality, and that happens through some other positive psychosocial effects on people. And so I was sort of in that realm, looking very focused on forgiveness, but also starting to think about what about other aspects of religiousness and belief and behavior. I continued to take courses in the religion department, and I took a number of courses with theologian Loyal Rue. And he wrote in one of his books, "The strategy of our species is to achieve personal wholeness and social coherence," or social cohesion. And his courses and his writings really helped me to think deeply about the cognitive and behavioral and emotional aspects of religious practice and identity. And rather than interpret this quote, which I think you could interpret as sort of a reduction or feeling discouraged by this or losing your faith, this thesis for me made me even more curious about God's benefits and about how God has created us to be in relationship with God and to be religious people. And I was even more excited to continue research on the benefits of other religious values and practices other than forgiveness. That landed me at Harvard Divinity School. And like Lindsay said, maybe not the most circuitous route, but it was a place that allowed me to continue looking at some of these questions from a different perspective. So one of the criticisms that was leveled at our early work on religion and health is, well, this is being written by sociologists and psychologists who have no idea what religion is. And so I thought, well, I'll show them. I'll get a degree in religious studies, and then they can still say that, but at least I have some letters behind my name for that. And so in divinity school, I was on this academic track, but my personal faith also really blossomed. So Harvard Divinity School is a multi-faith divinity school, and so I was able to worship every day with a different group of people. We had the Ducks, the Divinity UCC students, on Mondays. We had the Lutherans on Tuesdays. We had Women Church on Wednesdays. The Unitarians on Fridays. I could do a whole week of ecumenical worship, and between that and my fellow students, my faith really, really blossomed and deepened while I was there. I also got to strengthen my faith by continuing to explore religious belief through a social scientific lens. So this is Michael Jackson. I might look a little different than the Michael Jackson you know, but he is an anthropologist of religion who really helped me through his classes and his writings see the social magic, that social cohesion aspect of religious communities. I also took courses in lived religion, which is an ethnographic framework for understanding beliefs, practices, and experiences of religious people. And both of those experiences and perspectives led me to continue wondering about this question in a richer way: why and how is religiousness related to health? And so that question landed me at the University of California, Los Angeles in a health psychology program. And I began there to review the empirical evidence from the psychological science literature, from the biomedical literature on connections between religiousness and spirituality and health, with a particular focus on why we see those associations, or what might be the mechanisms of those associations. So I broadly categorize these mechanisms as psychosocial, biological, and behavioral. And this is my work with my PhD advisor, suggesting that these have been hypothesized mechanisms, and there is some evidence for each of these mechanisms. So to kind of break this down, for instance, perhaps people who are religious and spiritual have better social lives, better marriages, more friends, more support from their religious communities, more psychosocial benefits like more gratitude, more forgiveness, more optimism. And all of those things we know from other health psych work are related to mental and physical health. And so perhaps religion operates in that way. Maybe religious and spiritual people have better health behaviors. So Dan Osterbahn is in the audience here, and his daughter is working on this question right now with me. Maybe they take care of themselves by eating better, by going to the doctor and listening to the doctor. Maybe those kinds of behaviors, which are of course associated with health, are the reason that we see this association with religion and health. Maybe there are some biological reasons, some physiological reasons that religious and spiritual people are healthier. Now, of course, this is going to operate through some of these other mechanisms, but there is some research that suggests that religious and spiritual people have, say, lower levels of inflammation. Inflammation is relevant to most all of our diseases of aging, as well as some of our as depression, some of our mental health. And there's some other mechanisms with the HPA axis and the sympathetic nervous system as well that kind of suggest maybe religious people have a different way of responding to some of the things that we encounter day to day that lead to better health through physiological pathways. So my goal became to explore those pathways empirically, test these pathways. And again, rather than feeling like this kind of investigation would reduce faith to something biological or something that we can just explain with social science, for me, this exploration has really, again, strengthened my faith in a God who would create people and use our bodies, use our psychology to make religiousness something that is good for us, something that is having these benefits for us. At UCLA, I worked with this woman, Dr. Christine Dunkelstetter. She had done some research on religiousness, but her primary area is actually on stress and pregnancy, and stress and maternal mental health. So I had to fit my interest into that. And luckily for me, it's actually of particular interest to study religiousness and spirituality in the perinatal period among women who are pregnant or postpartum. And if you think about it, that might make sense because pregnancy and childbirth are times when religiousness and spirituality become especially salient for families. Right? So most people, if we look at birth narratives, will describe childbirth in language that we might call religious language or spiritual language. Most women view pregnancy, childbirth, parenthood through religious and spiritual lenses when we look at that evidence. It's also a time when parents are making decisions about religious rearing, right, or religious practices. And so again, it's becoming more salient. So this enhanced salience of religiousness and spirituality during pregnancy and postpartum make this a really interesting time to look at how religiousness is related to health. So the first study I conducted looked at perinatal women, specifically postpartum African American mothers, and their mental health. So I looked at 700 women who were interviewed over the first year of their child's life. So we interviewed them at 1 month after birth, 6 months after birth, and 12 months after the birth of their child. We asked them about a lot of things in their life, a lot of different psychosocial factors, their stress, their relationships, and their religiousness and spirituality. And we also asked them about their mental health. And what I found is that those women who were higher in religiousness, you can ignore this if this isn't your thing, I'll explain it. But those women who were higher in religiousness had, that was protective for them of increases in depressive symptoms after birth. So it wasn't that women who were higher in religiousness had a lower decline in depressive symptoms after birth, but it was that those women who were not religious and spiritual had an increase in depressive symptoms, especially in the first 6 months after birth. This also held for spirituality, so women who tended to be more spiritual and less religious, I saw this same association. But again, so this was kind of showing, yes, we have some empirical evidence, religiousness and spirituality connected to mental health. But again, my question here was really why and how? Why and how do we see this association? So my second study in a larger sample of about 2,500 postpartum women looked at, and again, looked at the psychosocial processes that might mediate this. So are women who are more spiritual and religious in the postpartum period, do they have higher levels of self-esteem, mastery, and optimism? And do those things then confer this benefit that we see in terms of depression? So this is an even worse figure that you don't have to pay attention to. But I found that, again, religiousness and spirituality were associated with better trajectories of depressive symptoms over that postpartum year. But I also showed that that effect was mediated or kind of explained by the mechanism of this effect were these psychosocial resources of mastery, self-esteem, and optimism. So this was a really, really exciting paper for me. Because this has always been my pet hypothesis, to be honest. So if we look at this whole thing, I know there's some evidence for the biological processes. I know there's some evidence for the behavioral processes. The hypothesis I care about the most and really get excited about exploring is the idea that religion packages psychosocial resources for us in a way that other institutions, other social experiences don't. And that's why we see this association of religiousness and spirituality with mental and physical health. So I was really excited about that paper. Shortly after that paper, I had another year of my dissertation, but there was this job at Hope College. And so I decided to apply to it and see what happened. And like Lindsay said in the introduction, I felt very called to be here. And in my tradition, in the Lutheran tradition, you need an internal call and you need an external call as well. And I heard that external call echoed during my visit and recruitment process. And so I ended up here at Hope, and I finished my dissertation, but I didn't finish what I had actually planned to do for my dissertation. We kind of hurried me up and finished. But here at Hope, I've been so lucky to work with students who share this excitement about understanding how religiousness is associated with better health. And so particular projects have focused on questions of how and why religiousness is associated with health, as well as for whom this association really operates. Because a lot of the previous work has been done on the general population, sort of these large correlational studies of the general population. But I want to know why and for whom this association exists. So these are some of my students pre-COVID. And one of them, Kim Paquette, did some interesting work looking at religiousness and health in a population of, these are not people who just got the COVID vaccine. These are kids who just got the polio vaccine, right? And so she did some really interesting work looking at associations of religiousness and health among polio survivors who developed post-polio syndrome as older adults. This is kind of like the long COVID that we're hearing about today. Post-polio syndrome is something that people, regardless of the severity of their polio, in their youth, develop this syndrome that includes pain and mobility limitations later in their lives as older adults. And Kim found that religiousness was associated with better mental health among these post-polio patients, but worse physical health, actually. And so this is showing maybe there's this association of religion and health is not universal. It might function differently for people who are chronically ill or who are living with disabilities. And so that was a really important work, and she's at Van Andel Institute now as a post-bac researcher, but working on publishing that in her spare time, right? And so again, this was kind of showing, well, maybe this religiousness and spirituality relationship to mental and physical health doesn't work for everybody at all times, and I'm interested in looking at that more. A lot of the work in my lab has focused on associations of religiousness and spirituality with health behaviors that are relevant to mental and physical health. We have a lot of pre-health students, like I said before. They're interested in health behaviors. They're pre-OT, occupational therapy, physical therapy. They want to get in and see that action of how can we improve people's health. So Amy Osterbahn is a senior in my lab right now, and she's been working on this and specifically looking at what is the relationship with religion and health when people leave religion, right? So if you're reading the Religion News Service, you're hearing all of this messaging about how young people are leaving the church in droves. look at the data. It's not quite as dire as the headlines make it out to be. But we do have a decline in religious participation. So what is that going to mean for health if we have this association of religiousness and spirituality with health? So Amy has been looking at this amazing data set that she got access to through a Psychi International Honor Society for Psychology grant. And she did it all on her own. Her dad's here, so he should be very. She did it all on her own. She got access to this. It was amazing. And it's a longitudinal, nationally representative data set, which for a study of religion and health is amazing. We don't really get those kind of data. And so what she's been doing is looking at risky health behaviors and their association with religiousness. So risky health behaviors are things like substance use and abuse, risky sexual behaviors, and then some health behaviors that are health promoting, like diet and sleep. And what she has found is that engaging in those risky behaviors predicts disaffiliation. So once you start to engage in some of these behaviors, higher levels of risky sex, especially also higher levels of substance use and abuse, we see that that's going to predict the likelihood that you are going to disaffiliate in the next 5-10 years. Disaffiliation also predicts even more risky behaviors and poor health outcomes. So it becomes kind of this positive loop there, but it's negative actually, right? Where we're seeing that people are leaving the church, leaving religion, and having worse health. And so this again raises interesting questions about the health benefits of religiousness. Like, for whom is that there? These people actually who leave religion, they look worse than the people who were never religious. And so there's something going on there for them that losing that community or leaving that community, leaving that belief is worse for them ultimately than never having had it in the first place. My work continues to be about exploring the mechanisms of associations between religiousness and health. And next year, fingers crossed, I will be on sabbatical, investigating this further in 2 samples of pregnant and postpartum women again. So in previous work that I showed you, I utilized data from a study of 2,500 postpartum women. And we did something really cool with that study, which is we asked, if you get pregnant again, contact us. So we had this postpartum period for child 1. And then if participants got pregnant again and wanted to be in another study, they contacted us again. What this means is, and then we followed them throughout their pregnancy and the postpartum year of that subsequent child. What that means is we have preconception data for a pregnancy. That never happens because you would have to follow a bunch of people just waiting for them to get pregnant, and some of them will and some of them won't. And you need to get tenure and stuff, right? So you don't have that kind of time. So we followed them. We have a sample of about 300 women who subsequently got pregnant. And so I know about their religiousness and spirituality before they even conceived this subsequent child. And so I'll be looking at how religiousness and spirituality predicts health behaviors, biological markers of health, as well as mental health during their pregnancy and subsequent and during postpartum, as well as how mothers' religiousness and spirituality predicts health outcomes for those infants in that year. So that will be really cool. In another similar study, the study that was supposed to be my dissertation, but I came here instead, this was a 2-site study with pregnant women where we brought women in to the lab at first trimester, second trimester, and third trimester, and then also at 1, 6, and 12 months after birth. And we did really intensive biological assays on them. So I have stress hormones from them. I have inflammation. I have actually their ultrasound measurements from during pregnancy. And then I have developmental data on their infants. And so again, we'll be looking at how religiousness and spirituality is related to mental and physical health and what the mechanisms are, because I also have really cool measures in that study of forgiveness, gratitude, self-esteem, mastery, optimism, and those sorts of things. So that kind of sums up what I do within this broader question of how religiousness and spirituality are related to mental and physical health. And again, this work really remains a passion for me because it brings me closer to God and deepens my faith to understand how religiousness works in our lives to impact our health. I continue my research in hopes that by making the impacts of religiousness more clear and understandable, I'm glorifying God, who created us to be in relationship through our religiousness. So thank you so much for listening today, and I'm happy to take any questions. Steve.
You haven't talked about what you mean by religiousness, and it seems like that's a big thing.
Yeah, I took out the slide that was like defining our terms. We need an operational definition. But yes, absolutely. So typically within health psychology and psychological science that looks at religion versus spirituality, we're looking at religion as more of a behavioral, behaviors that are related to some sort of tradition related to the sacred. Spirituality might be more beliefs related to the sacred, but not necessarily through that organized community. Now, what I say is, like, for some people, those are completely overlapping things. For some people, those are completely non-overlapping things. And for most of us, there's sort of a Venn diagram there. And so there is it is tricky to operationalize something that is so personal to us, right? But as social scientists, we have to operationalize. And so there are questions, I do in the introduction to questions sort of say, like, by religious, I mean such and such, or we mean such and such and such. So then to what extent are you religious, or consider yourself a religious person? By spirituality, we mean such and such and such. To what extent are you a spiritual person? At other times, I don't do that because as a psychological scientist, I'm more concerned with their perception of their own religiousness, spirituality, than I am necessarily of, like, it fitting into a specific definition that might line up with dogma or something like that. But there are folks who look at particular beliefs about God or about heaven and how that's related to health, and those are some really interesting studies as well. So. A lot of the early work in this area focused on religious attendance because that's super measurable, right? And so that's kind of a clear operationalization. I don't really like that because, well, especially like right now in COVID, like religious attendance is meaningless, right? But also, it doesn't necessarily get at your own perception, right? We can go to religious services for a lot of different reasons, social reasons that may not connect necessarily to beliefs and identity. Yeah, Eric.
How has this field of study impacted your own religiousness and spirituality?
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. So, I think this was something that we talked about in Continuum over the summer. There were several scientists, and I was a biology major as an undergrad. And I think for a lot of people, there is a tension there, and that's understandable. For me, that has never been a tension, and it's always been more of an excitement and a curiosity and an opportunity, because I really do feel like by understanding more about humanity, about people, about psychology, I'm getting closer to God, because we as God's creation, I just feel a lot of awe and wonder at the way that we work psychologically, and sort of that as a way, and understanding how that kind of helps us to be in relationship with God and be religious. So for me, it's been something that has strengthened that a lot. I know that for other people looking at this kind of research, it can be something that challenges their faith. One of my advisors would say, like, well, if you understand why you like chocolate, does it make you like chocolate less? If you understand why you like sex, does it make you like sex less? Like, probably no, right? You still like those things. And so that was like a helpful thing for me as an undergraduate to think about, like, okay, by understanding how something works, I'm not like debunking it. I'm just like further understanding it. And I think as I grew in that research, it became, not only am I just further understanding it, but like I'm delighting in it, right? And it's another way that I delight in God's creation. Scott.
So in the average Baptist literature, mastery is strategy and goals oriented towards accomplishing a task, loving learning, being safe and part of the process, versus performance, which is the other phrase that's used there, which is more of a normative comparison, ritual compared to others. Is that what health psychologists mean?
So I think of mastery more like self-efficacy, but not domain dependent. So self-efficacy is like a feeling that I can achieve a certain thing. Mastery is a feeling like I can achieve the things I'm going to need to achieve in general. So that's more what I'm talking about with mastery here. So in Shelley Taylor's work, a health psychologist, social health psychologist, she talks about these sort of beneficial illusions that we have about ourselves. We all think we're above average. We all think that things are going to go pretty well for us. And those are associated with better mental health and actually better physical health. And so that work on the self-esteem, mastery, optimism, those sorts of constructs, that comes from Shelley's work sort of saying, like, these are beneficial illusions we know are related to better mental and physical health. Yeah. Andy?
Apologies, that was late. Alyssa, thank you so much for this. One question about mastery. When you did the research on the women having the children the second time around, was there any change in that?
So stay tuned, because that's what I'm planning to do if I'm on sabbatical next year.
A follow-up to say, it's really fascinating to me that you pursued this and you talked about having that you have this preconception data now and so forth. Had people done this before? I mean, in other words, or was it rather new to have a second? I would assume that some folks would approach this the same way before asking people to get pregnant again. Let us know, but had that been done before, or is it kind of was this a real?
Yeah. I don't know of other preconception data in the United States. So there are Scandinavian countries that are smaller and have socialized medicine and follow people just because they're their patients, like they're the government's patients, so they have tons of data. So like the Finns have amazing data. And so I'm sure they have preconception data. But in the US, and there's a Canadian study that I think also has preconception data. I don't know of any other studies in the United States with preconception data. And also, like, I'm in a unique small group of health psychologists who care about religion and spirituality, right? So it's very unlikely that any of those other data sets have religious items in them that I could utilize. So it is unique in that way.
Cool.
Yeah.
Casey? I think you just answered my question, but it was I was curious of perhaps societies that I'm going to use the word better, but
Okay.
maybe a more objective term, kind of holistic and inclusive healthcare infrastructure. And I was just curious of if, thinking particularly of women in postpartum health, right? Like, is there a correlation?
Yeah. Right.
I hope you understand my lack of question.
I think so. What I will say is that in the religion and health data, we do see that when people have a lot of other resources, religiousness and spirituality seem to be less important for their health. So I would suspect that in countries that have a lot of support for women in the postpartum period, that religiousness and spirituality would be less predictive because they're having their more basic needs met. So that would be my prediction, but I don't know. I know we see that, like Dave Meyer's work, looking across countries instead of within countries. we do see that in, as education, as income rises, or in more educated, more higher income countries, we see less religiousness in general. And I would expect, we're sort of an anomaly in the US. I would expect that would kind of mirror or look similar to some of the in-country information we have from the US that suggests that people higher in other resources, there's a weaker relationship between religion and health. Does that get at what you were asking? Okay. Kate, and then.
Yeah, so I have a couple questions. No, this is great, and this is really connected to my own research, so maybe there's just kind of, questions on different tracks. But one, I'm curious if any of your research has indicated that there's kind of like a split where for some people they do experience this really positive connection between health and religion, but for some people it's like the opposite, the negative effect. So that seems to be what I've kind of found with like mental health. There's not a lot of neutral, like people whose religious stuff hasn't impacted their mental health, but we have like really positive effects and then some like really negative exacerbating effects. And then I'm also curious about kind of just like the reverse of that diagram. Like, are there reasons to think that people who experience less physical and mental pain or whose bodies are predisposed to experience less pain, like, are more likely to be religious?
Yeah.
And so that's like the direction of it.
Yeah. Okay. So let me take the first question. So there is a lot of research looking at negative health effects of religiousness. Absolutely. Most of that is looking at negative religious experiences and how that is associated with negative mental health, right? So so I'm happy to give you some resources, and you probably already know them. But yeah, that's robustly in the literature. If we look kind of in these nationally representative large samples, we see an overall benefit. But absolutely, there is that. I think this might get at maybe your second question, but one of the things that's really interesting about the work that Amy is doing with disaffiliation is that typically you're looking at people who are religious and who aren't. And that aren't category is including people who were never, ever religious and people who had an experience that made them leave the church or leave the faith, right? So by disaggregating that group and showing like these people who are leaving are actually having worse health, we're kind of showing some of what you're asking. And I think it kind of challenges the field to separate those groups. Don't just treat nuns as just all the same, N-O-N-E, nuns, right? Then your second question, can you repeat it?
Yeah, that was about like the other direction.
Yeah. So there is definitely some research that shows like people who are more physically healthy can do some of these behaviors. And so a lot of the early work that just looks at religious attendance, that was a main criticism. Like, well, are people who are attending more healthier because of something to do with attendance, or are they just able to attend more? And so that's why I'm interested in looking at more of a multidimensional measure of religiousness and spirituality that looks at other things. I think that, like in the polio work and some other work that I haven't done but I know of, what we see is that actually people who are experiencing worse health will be more, they'll engage in more religious behaviors, religious and spiritual behaviors as a coping mechanism. And so that's what I think is going on in the polio data, even though those are cross-sectional, is that we see people who are having more symptoms, post-polio syndrome symptoms, are turning to religiousness and spirituality. And that's having a beneficial effect on their mental health, but it's not a strong enough thing to undo that they have long polio, right? And so we see that worse physical health persisting. So that's my guess, and I have seen that cross-sectional association in other work and the same sort of guess about what's going on there. I don't know of longitudinal work that has looked at that. Yeah. Lindsay.
Well, Kate and I were on exactly the same track because I wanted to ask about sort of the for whom question that you brought up when you were talking about Kim's work and how this is so. I love hearing you talk about this because I think your work is so thick and robust, and that there are so many ways to think about what we would consider moderators or things that might say, oh, for these people it works in this way, and there's a lot of space to do that work. I didn't know if you had anything else to reflect on in terms of for whom this might be at play. And you did talk about one of the things I thought you were talking about in the question, so
Okay.
that's all for now, that's fine.
No, another thing I think about with that, it kind of connects maybe to Casey's question, which is we see benefits of religiousness and spirituality for people who live in majority religious countries because it's essentially like an in-group benefit. When you're living somewhere, so there's some interesting work on religion and health from Israel, and then some work on like the diaspora, so sort of saying like if you're living somewhere where you're being persecuted for your religious beliefs, having those religious beliefs really strongly might not be associated with some of certainly these mediators, right? You're not necessarily getting the social support, but maybe you are because of your very strong insular community. So there's some tension there, I think, but you're not getting some of the societal benefits that might come from being religious in a society more like ours. So I think that's a good question, yeah. Well, I think.
That's great.
Okay.